Good day. I'd like to introduce your main speaker for today. He's appeared in more than 150 movies and television shows, including Every Which Way But Loose with Clint Eastwood, The Sting with Paul Newman and Robert Redford, Papillon with Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman, and the television miniseries Roots. But first and foremost, he's the husband for 26 years of a wonderful woman by the name of Gwen, the father of 6 beautiful children ranging in age from 5 to 25, and the grandfather of 4. He was a member of the Special Forces during the Vietnam era and later became a fellow with the Chalcedon Foundation for 7 years, which is a Christian think tank operated by Dr. R.J. Rushtoney in Northern California. In October of 1995, he was unanimously elected the national spokesman for the American Jural Society and is now the host of the American Jural Society Hour, a nightly 1-hour nationwide radio show on the Media Bypass Radio Network. And finally, I would like to add that throughout the history of the world, there have been many political and religious reformations. In all of these reformations, there have always been special men with special words, and these men all had one thing in common. They knew that their lives were not their own, but belonged to the Lord. These men included, of course, the Apostle John, John Wycliffe in the 14th century, John Calvin and John Knox in the 17th century, John Adams and John Hancock in the 18th century, and John Randolph in the 19th century. And in the New Reformation, which is beginning to sweep our country, we have John William Saunders III, better known as John Quade. Let's give him a warm welcome.
I was in Fort Worth yesterday shooting a television thing for a friend of mine. And on the way out there, Randy and I were driven out there by a lady who conducts tour guides here in Dallas and in Fort Worth and elsewhere. And I've known this lady for some time, a couple of years anyway. And we were talking about the differences between Dallas and Fort Worth and everything. And I think the one difference that summed up everything was that in Dallas, what they call sushi, they call bait in Fort Worth. Now, that does speak to a certain extent to a level, I guess, of sophistication in Dallas. And it's been my experience over the past 2 or 3 years since I started speaking on behalf of the law reform movement, that there was a level of sophistication in Dallas that was not normal in other cities. There was also something else, which for me was far more important, and that was that the people in Texas, as a rule, and I know everybody and his brother takes advantage of Texas and the people of Texas, and when dealing with them in film and television, and tries to make you all out to be something you're not. The one thing I enjoyed about coming to Texas is Texans. There really is something unique in Texas. And that uniqueness alone is worthy of being a separate nation and separate republic. Because of it came into the Union after 1840. There's a spirit in Texas that kind of motivates Texans to be a little bolder than some other people and to do things that most other people in other states wouldn't even consider doing. I don't know many people that'll walk into a court with an abatement in their hand and walk right up to the judge while he's in the middle of a session with somebody else and hand him the abatement and walk out. But they do that in Texas. See, normally in California they get a sheriff's deputy or something to serve the process, or they'll send it by registered mail, but not in Texas. And in California, people kind of dance around the religious question sometimes, and the impact of Christianity and its basis in law and the common law. But in Texas, they don't make any bones about it. and they don't hesitate to express the God they believe in, and to do so honestly and forthrightly. That, to me, is special. But I think every Texan, when they come up to me, they always ask me the same thing. They say, John, where are you from? And I say, well, I'm a Kansan by birth, a Texan by choice, and a Californian by the providence of God. Take your choice. Because Texas is kind of my adopted state. I enjoy coming here, and I enjoy being with Texans. I've shot movies here, and I've lectured here, and I've taught the best I knew, and it was always seemed to be enough. No matter how much I messed up on my facts and figures, I always had people in the audience who were willing to listen, and listen good. And what I have to tell you tonight is something that you better listen good to, real good, because it affects everything that happens in civil government in this nation. But it also does something else. It also explains why the non-statutory abatement that principally Randy Lee and others developed, I was involved primarily. My involvement was just sitting at the typewriter, banging away and banging away and banging away. And Randy said, no, John, make that italicized right there. Or you want to bold this section right here where it says thirdly and everything. I said, sure thing. And I'm sitting there beating away and typing all the notes. And like when we did the non-statutory abatement handbook, there's an appendix in there, in Appendix A in the back of the Book of the Hundreds. And it's called The Nature of Emergency Powers and Martial Rule. Randy and I wrote that in about 4 days. And there's 102 footnotes in there. And somebody asked me one time, why so many footnotes? And I said, well, I told Randy when we started writing that essay that it was to provide some kind of background and logical structure as to the present system of government, to explain what it is and how it came to be, and why it's essential that we start jural societies based on God's law and the common law and maxims of law, and also why we as individuals must learn again the old ways, as it says in Scripture, and why we as American people must learn how to do the common law process correctly when it really is common law process. There's a lot out there that styles itself as common law process, but in fact isn't. And based on my experience that Randy mentioned before at the Chalcedon Foundation, Dr. R.J. Rushton would always tell me, he says, John, an essay is no good without plenty of substantial footnotes, because he says modern man is incapable of it. So the real research in that essay goes to Randy Lee, because he and the other guys, there's about a dozen of us in California and the West and elsewhere, who accepting and digesting a logical argument. He wants some authority to show him that this doesn't rely on the writer's opinion, it relies on excellent authority. Well, I was satisfied with just using biblical verses, but Dr. Rushton, he said, the only thing that works and gets their attention is to bury them in footnotes. Well, when we wrote this essay in the back of the American Jural Society handbook, I happened to mention this to Randy Lee, and for the next 4 days, that's what he proceeded to do. And in my mom's bedroom there, a spare bedroom in my mom's place, it looked like a snowstorm hit the place, because there was little stacks of paper all over the place and on top of the computer, and oftentimes under the keyboard hanging out where I could type in a quote, and then there was in the window, and he had pieces stuck in the window and everything else. And for 4 days, while I typed, Randy sit there and buried me in footnotes. So the real research in that essay goes to Randy Lee, because he and the other guys, there's about a dozen of us in California and the West and elsewhere, who are kind of an informal think tank in the common law. We criticize each other's works and things of that nature. Randy Lee is one of those rare men that's not afraid to put his money where his mouth is. And he's a man's man, and he's a ladies' man, except that Except that he doesn't have time for the ladies now. He's so busy touring with me and trying to keep me in one piece long enough to do another session. But Randy's done the principal research, and he was the first man, by the way, to prove the nom de guerre argument in an actual situation, in an appearance in United States District Court on an IRS order to show cause. And by this one little act, and no one had ever done this before, so we didn't have any precedence for it. We didn't have any authority for it. Randy was simply trying to test the theory of the case that we had insofar as how we mount an effective defense. And so he had been studying about the nom de guerre and a few other things, although we didn't have a lot of sites for it at that time. And he had this appearance coming up in United States District Court on this order to show cause from the IRS. And so he goes down to court and he takes his briefcase with him, and he had a few goodies in it. And he walks in and sits down in court, and eventually the clerk calls his case, and Randy stands up and goes forward, you know, and he says, "May I speak, Your Honor?" And the judge said, "Yes, you may." And the judge is messing with paperwork on his desk and not really paying much attention to Randy. You know, he's just another victim coming in there to get fleeced, right? So, or sliced and diced. They have a lot of different ways they like to do it now for variety's sake. Anyway, the judge is messing with his paperwork, and the U.S. attorney is sitting over there with his coat pulled back and his feet stretched out like, well, this poor dumb sucker. He's going to get his pants taken off. Well, what Randy said was basically this. My name is not spelled capital R, capital A, capital N, capital D, capital Y, capital L, period, and so on. In fact, my private Christian name is capital R, lowercase a, N, D, Y. And my flag is the original flag of the California Republic, and he took one of those little miniature flags and he set it up on the podium just like this. And he stood up there. By now, the judge has quit messing with the papers on his desk, and he's got both eyes on Randy Lee. And then the last piece, Randy lays his Bible up there, and he says, "In my law is the family Bible." He said a couple of more things, and then he said, "Further I say it not." There was kind of a pregnant pause there, and the judge turned to the United States Attorney, Mr. Roth, and he says, "Well, Mr. Roth, what do you have to say about this case of mistaken identity?" And the United States Attorney says, "Well, Your Honor, he seems to think there's some kind of special significance in whether his name is capitalized or not, blah, 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 blah." And the judge said, "Very well. Next case." Now, notice that the judge did not dismiss anything because there never was a case. And as Randy knew, and as a lot of people are beginning to learn, when one goes into court, or when one files process, or when one is served process, there's only one lawful name in which that process can be filed. And that is your fully spelled, first, middle, and last, upper and lower case Christian name. The name you got when you were baptized. And Randy knew that. And since there was no case, the judge said, "Sir, would you pick up your things, please? You can go." And Randy walked out of court, and the whole process only took about 4 minutes. But what it did was, it told us that the nom de guerre was not only a good argument, an argument against the nom de guerre was not only a good plea, but it seemed to carry a sense of strength that those of us in the Patriot movement are not used to. I mean, I made 16 appearances in court on traffic tickets and went to jail 4 times. Lost every single appearance that I made in court. Pleading every argument that the Patriot community had coughed up over the last 10 years. I used a different one in every case. "I have the right to travel, Your Honor." Right, guilty. Now, later I found out that the right to travel is a commercial term. Most people in the movement don't know that, see? But then we did the research to find out. The right to travel is a commercial term, and the only common law term that's its equivalent is liberty to use the common ways. That's the only common law expression for what we do when we slip behind the wheel of an automobile and go down the road. We are exercising the liberty of the common ways. At any rate, after I'd lost all these cases and everything else, I had pretty much gotten to the point to where I was out of ideas. And then I provoked, I mean, you could say that. I didn't believe it at the time, but his blood pressure kind of went up a little bit in this one appearance that I made against the assistant district attorney of the county where I live. And I was standing up there making an argument, which of course was totally out of place in a municipal or a traffic court, as I come to find out later why. But I did it anyway just to see what would happen. And the assistant district attorney jumped up and he says, if you make one more reference to the Constitution or to precedent or stare decisis, he says, I'm going to have you sanctioned. Well, I didn't even know what he meant by sanctions at the time. But I found out what I wanted to know, because he added a little phrase at the end of that in which he said, the only law in this court is the law that comes out of that judge's mouth. That sounds like a military court. And when I added that piece of information to a few things, and then Randy continuing to dig in all the law libraries in California, this man spends fortune on copying costs in these law libraries, I think which are mostly sustained by endowments from Randy Lee's feeding coins into the copy machines. The bottom line is that what with Randy's experience and my experience and that of a couple of other people, we began to put together this theory of the case. And then we began to implement it in the form of a non-statutory abatement, the first version of which was issued a little over a year ago after we had already tried it half a dozen times or so in California. And each time it worked, we gained a little more confidence. And we kept tweaking it and changing, making little changes and things like that. At one time, I know in the first version of the abatement that we put out, why we had cites in there from the California Code of 1872. And a lot of people were running around looking for the original codification of the common law in their state and not having much luck. And then we continued to do research, primarily Randy and a couple of friends of ours in the San Fernando Valley, and we finally figured out that we don't need to cite the 1872 codes because there's another way to do it with maxims of law. See, when you cite something in Latin, it has a tendency to intimidate, first off, okay? Because he looks, a judge will look at the paperwork and he'll go, and then he'll start looking for a glossary of some kind in the back to explain the maxims. See, of course, because he doesn't know what they're talking about. You know, like when you say, sua potestate esse. Judge doesn't know what that is. Sua potestate esse et ux or. That means Lord of the dominions and wife. See, much stronger term than sui juris. It also puts the man, by virtue of the maxim, on the land. All right, not on a mere parcel that's insured by title insurance and everything else. Now, having said all this, the question then becomes, but what was it that you understood about the existing system that made the abatement work? Well, that story is a little longer and a little more detailed. Part of it is in Appendix A of the American Jural Society Handbook that's in the Book of the Hundreds. And by the way, the reason why we call it the Book of the Hundreds is because in Old England and in a few of the early colonies in America, it took several hundreds in order to form a county. They were small communities of hundreds, of up to 100 people. And when enough people and enough hundreds got together, they would form a county, which was the next level of government. Now, we decided that because our book is basically a manual, when you get right down to the bottom line, it's a manual on how to start your own hundred with people of like mind. And it uses the same law that the ancient English used. the common law, or as we say, the lex non scripta. You see, you walk into court, assuming you're stupid enough to go into court, okay, because none of our people make an appearance, because you're dead meat if you do, and for reasons which I'll come to in a minute. But if you're talking to a judge or a lawyer and you say, well, the lex non scripta says, you know, right, the judges don't know anything about Latin anymore. You know, they gave that up in college. It was too cumbersome. Besides, it's a dead language, which is precisely the reason why we use it, because it's not subject to interpretation. A dead language doesn't change its meaning. You see? So, you say the lex non scripta, law not written, lex, law, non, not, scripta, written. Lex non scripta, you're saying the law not written, which is the superior law to all forms of law except the scripture, which is the highest law of the land. And it is today, still today, the law of the land. And is the superior jurisdiction in every court in these United States. If you can call them courts. They're a kind of court. All right. By the way, the court's not the judge, it's not the building, it's not the lawyers, it's not a plaintiff and a defendant. It's a process, the paperwork. Okay, because without the process, there isn't any court anyway. All right, so just clear that up for a second here now. When I say if they're a court, in fact, after considerable research, we discovered that all the inferior courts in these United States, below the state Supreme Court and below the United States Supreme Court, are military courts or tribunals sitting in summary court-martial proceedings against civilians. That's why, guys, since none of those courts can hear constitutional arguments or statute arguments or any other kind of argument, that's why when you go into such courts, you lose as if you were constantly taking a knife to a gunfight. All right? It doesn't fly, because that's why the district attorney said to me way back when, in my 15th or 16th appearance in court, that the only law in this court comes out of the mouth of the judge. Because in military courts, the judge's word is law, not the Constitution, not statutes, not anything else, except for the 1984 and 94 Manual of Courts Martial. And I hardly recommend that book to you, by the way. That's the 1984/94 Manual of Courts Martial. It's a red-covered book. It's about yay thick, and it's in the 8 by 10 format, roughly. All right? Small print, and that whole 9 yards. All right? Of course, that book's out of print now, so it may be hard to find one. We just happened to find it at the right moment in time. At any rate, we said, well, now, wait a minute. How in the world now are we going into military courts? I mean, you know, what about the Constitution? And what about the law and all these other kinds of things and our rights and everything? Well, as it turns out, in doing research on the matter, we went all the way back to the War of Northern Aggression, or the War of Secession, or the war between the states, whatever you want to call it. For my personal preference, it was the War of Northern Aggression. That was specifically, deliberately, and with malice created by one A. Lincoln in order that he might become the father of a new country. And that's why we call him the father of a new country. Now, that's kind of a harsh statement to make about someone that seems so well respected in all the textbooks and all the television and the media and everything else, but the bottom line comes down to this. In 1860, the division began to occur in the Congress. In 1861, 7 southern states walked out of Congress. The Congress was thus left without sufficient members or attendees or representatives in order to form a quorum. Without a quorum, and if you read any book on parliamentary law, without a quorum, you can't do business of any kind, except submit a motion to make a quorum, that is to go out and get people and bring them in, or to adjourn. And if you fail to adjourn properly, your deliberative body, or in this case, the legislature of the United States of America, becomes sine die, another Latin term, means literally without day. In other words, if you create a little deliberative body, like a small government of some kind, or if your county's civil government, and I keep using that word civil as if they really had law, doesn't matter if they adjourn improperly without setting a day and time set certain to reconvene, they cease to exist according to the rules of the parliamentary law under which the Congress and all deliberative bodies of government in this country sit. In other words, guys, if you don't set a date to get back together again, whether it's day after tomorrow, next month, next year, or whatever, all right, you cease to exist in law as a parliamentary body. And thus you are left without day, or without a day to reconvene, and you become, without day, sine die, and you cease to exist in law as a valid, constitutional, lawful, or otherwise body. Now, what evidence do we have for this very fact? It comes down to this. If you go down to your local library and you pull down volume 1 of the Titles and Codes, you'll see there's a table of contents there in the beginning of it, right? And you look at all the titles, and it's in the top left corner you'll see Title 1, the Presidency, Title 2, the Congress, Title 3, the Judiciary, etc. And if you don't skip by too quick, you'll notice there's an asterisk next to Title 2, the Congress. You go down to the bottom of the page, and the asterisk says resolution, not positive law. Now, there's no asterisk next to Title 1 or Title 3, but there is next to Title 2. A few months after the Congress walked out, A. Lincoln, actually this is just a few weeks, A. Lincoln seized control of the government and issued the very first executive order to call up 75,000 troops. Executive Order number 1, April 21st, 1861. With that executive order, Lincoln began a course of action which formally terminated the Constitution for the United States of America as the supreme law of the land and ended the life of the Republic. The formal death of the Republic took place on September 22nd, 1862, with the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. The reason why that date is chosen is because for the first time in American constitutional history, Abraham Lincoln asserted federal jurisdiction over black people in the states, and at the same time asserted federal jurisdiction over white people within the states. And for those of you who've done your study of history, you know there were no citizens of the United States until after the war between the states. Before then, the United States government had no citizens it could tax, which is one of the reasons why they created the 14th Amendment, by the way. All right. They knew they probably couldn't get away with it, you know, by including white people, so they just went after the minorities who didn't have the knowledge and the training of the common law that the average white person had. Now, all this was set up, of course, by a decision rendered by Chief Justice Taney in the famous Dred Scott v. Sanford case. And there's an awful lot of people in the movement that keep citing that case for various reasons and arguments. My recommendation to you is that you stay away from that case for one reason. Because every authority in law that I have ever read on the matter knows the case was contrived by Justice Taney on grounds that cannot be sustained in law. Why is that? Because Taney's whole argument comes down to this, that there were no free blacks who owned property in America prior to the Constitution of the United States of America, and thus the Constitution could not apply to black people. That's his argument. Now, Appleton in 5 Maine, 505, and also Thomas, in another decision, who was a student of Appleton, made it very clear, because they provided nearly 100 pages of documentation, that there were not only blacks in both the North and the South who were free, before the Constitution was signed, but they also owned property and voted in elections. And there were also major black slaveholders who owned slaves in both the North and the South. Now that kind of changes your picture. Then why would Taney do what he did? Because it turns out that Chief Justice Taney was a major slaveholder and had major property tied up in slaves. The decision that he rendered in that case was purely to serve his own self-interest. Had nothing to do with law, had nothing to do with history, had nothing to do with the Constitution. It was a decision that he created to protect his own investment. And anybody who knows what's going on in terms of the modern law knows that it doesn't do you any good to cite that case because there's too many ways around it. And there must be a dozen cases out there to back that up. Now, the important thing is, if you go through and investigate what Lincoln did during this period of time, you find out that Lincoln seized power unconstitutionally and declared war unconstitutionally because he had no Congress who could make war, and thus began the greatest debacle, life and death struggle in the history of America. More men died in that war than in all the rest of the wars combined, practically. I mean, I think we all know that. But the real rub in the face of everyone during that period of time was Mr. Lincoln went up to Columbia University and he hired a man, professor by the name of Lieber, who wrote what was called the Lieber Instructions or the Lieber Code, which governs the acts of a president under martial law. But Lincoln never declared martial law. Well, Mr. Lieber in Article 1, Section 1 of the Lieber Code states very explicitly that when martial law is declared, the people or the inhabitants of the country over which martial law is declared need not be informed. All right? Well, wait a minute. You mean he imposed martial law and didn't tell anybody? That's exactly what happened. Because from that time on, the courts changed, the electoral process changed. How many of you know that there was no voting in secret until after the war between the states? This gentleman over here is shaking his head. He's already done some research. He knows. What is the significance of voting in secret? Well, your ballot doesn't have any force and effect in law when you vote in secret. Only when you vote in public, as the Congress and the rest of the so-called deliberative bodies in this country, only when you vote in public as a lawful elector, not as a voter, because voters are a class of people whose property's been liened for the good of the ship of the state, to ensure the ship of state. Okay? When lawful electors elect someone, they always do it in the open. That's the only way a lawful election can be held. All other forms of elections in secret have no force and effect and no binding effect on the politicians that are elected. All right? Now you stop and think, you mean to tell me that since the war between the states, every president has been elected because somebody wanted him elected? Certainly wasn't because the people's vote had any effect in it. Who was electing the president? Well, the Electoral College made a convenient out there, you see. And if you go back and look at the history of the Electoral College in the 10, 15, 20 years after the war between the states, you'll see that there was a lot of controversy in the Electoral College, and several presidents or men who became president played some real fancy games in order to get themselves installed in office. Now, that's not covered too much in the history books and the textbooks. It is covered, mentioned usually in footnotes in many of the law books, not the mainstream law books. For example, those published by West Publishing Company Now, you say, wait a minute now, then Congress exists only by resolution. Why do they exist at all, if that's the case? Well, because Mr. Lincoln used part of those 75,000 troops he called up by Executive Order number 1, to go out and bring the Congress back into session at gunpoint. Every congressman, every senator, etc., and their principal members of their staff were brought back to Washington, D.C. and placed into session at gunpoint. And throughout the duration of the war between the states, the entire Congress, the halls of the Senate and the House, were guarded 24 hours a day, and no member left without a military escort or went any place. When he went home at night, there's a military escort there, went with him. That's part of what the 75,000 troops were assigned to do, by the way. Now, turns out that by the time Roosevelt came along, and we all know because of Dr. Gene Schroeder's work, which, by the way, was very instrumental in assisting us, anyway, and pointing us in the right direction, we all know what happened in March 1933 with FDR and his executive orders and everything else. And a lot of people who know that the martial law actually came into effect during the war between the states, they say, well, then what was the point of what Roosevelt did? And the answer, that's very simple. Because not all states were declared to be under martial law by A. Lincoln. It had that effect in some northern states, but that was quickly terminated, all right, very quietly, without any fanfare. But when all these other states came into the Union after the war between the states, their status was kind of up in the air a little bit because they were lawfully created, but the Congress that supposedly approved the Enabling and Admissions Act was not. So what Mr. Lincoln, what the Congress did, or what the powers that be did, when FDR came to power, they advised him to declare a national emergency, which included all the states, so that all the states would then have one common law administered under the military by which they were ruled. And by the way, people, for those of you who pay attention to the way heraldry of states and the federal government and everything else is displayed, I mean the flags and the symbols of authority and everything else, why is it the United States flag flies over the flag of Texas? Exactly, because it's a conquered state. Now think about that, guys. Texas and every other state in this union is a conquered entity who's incorporated by the force of military law into not a republic, not even a democracy, although theoretically democracies can exist under military dictatorship, or, excuse me, not a dictatorship. I keep forgetting. There are certain technical niceties that we need to obey, or think of at least. Whether we verbalize them or not is another matter, but there are certain things that we need to keep in mind, that since the Congress now exists only by resolution, when the Congress passed all these Enabling and Admissions Acts, where did they get the authority to do it? Well, the answer to that is found in the fact that since the Commander-in-Chief is the top man in the country, every act of the United States Congress, since they were ordered back into session at bayonet point in 1862, has only been passed, has only been written on the basis of a pre-existing executive order. Thus, when Congress came back into session, Lincoln had a half dozen executive orders already written up and had many, many other acts that he'd done. The Congress passed a flurry of legislation, all of which ratified what Lincoln had already done. Same thing happened in March 1933, wasn't it? Roosevelt made his declaration of a national emergency and had the banking crisis and all these other executive orders. He changed the Trading with the Enemy Act to make us all enemies. You see, belligerents under international law and municipal law and all these kind of good things. And while Congress was out of session, as soon as Congress came back in session, what did Congress do? They ratified them all. Usually within almost all, except for one, and I can't remember which one it was, were ratified within 48 hours. And there was a lot of protests at that time in various isolated places that, I don't even get a chance to read the bills and I get passed. A lot of complaints in that regard. The point was is that once FDR had done what he did, he became the last of the unholy trinity, which included not just A. Lincoln, but also Tom Jefferson, who was the first to bring international law into the District of Columbia when he initiated a campaign in Congress to pass and approve the laws of war, which automatically invokes international and municipal law within the District of Columbia when there's a national emergency of some kind. Now the question becomes, how do we know when we're under a national emergency? When the president decides there's one, no one else has anything to say about it. Not the courts, not the Congress, not the Justice Department, not the FBI, nobody. Example, the banking crisis that was created, or excuse me, wasn't created, that was allowed, no, that's not right either, that just happened in 1931 and 32. Now this banking crisis, there's not a whole lot of information about it out there because it kind of smells when you start adding up the numbers. Basically what happened was is the banks in the United States were taking in gold coins, $20 gold pieces, you see, and issuing back for them gold certificates, which at the time nobody minded. Gold was at 21, 22, sometimes as high as 22.10, 22.20 an ounce, etc., but it always dropped back. What the American people didn't know was that the bankers were taking in the gold at $21 to $22 an ounce and then reselling it overseas at $34 an ounce. But what most Americans don't know is the gold never left the country. Not one bar, not one coin left the country. Why? Because it was all in the bank vaults in New York City, and they had a whole series of rather large bank vaults created during that period of time, and they were very, very large, concrete, reinforced steel, and everything else with all kinds of security measures done up on them, and basically they duplicated what already existed at Fort Knox. And then what they did on the floor, they painted a checkerboard on the floor, and each square was a different color. And you'd walk into this vault and you'd see pallets of gold bars sitting on these different colored squares. And any time there was a change in the balance of payment, the little guy'd come in his little forklift and pick up a forklift full of gold bars and go over and move it on another colored square. And that's how they settled the balance of payments. But the gold never left the United States. Well, yeah, but all the gold went to England. We all know that. Well, it didn't. Sorry, but before Lend-Lease, anybody remember what the size of the sale of U.S. arms and material and everything else was to England? Ran into several $1 billion, and Roosevelt's price for making that sale was that England, through Mr. Churchill, pay in gold. The next time England placed an order for materials and Roosevelt demanded gold, Churchill says, you got it all last time. And thus Lend-Lease was created, in which they lent the materials and everything else to England to continue the war with a lease that began as soon as the war terminated. Now, nothing particularly significant about that, except that the lease demanded payments in gold. Now, you really start thinking about this kind of stuff, and it makes perfect sense that all the gold would be here. Because every time you turn it around, there's a war in Europe, or in Asia, or in Africa, and the governments in South America are constantly rising and falling and rising and falling, and thus the only place where there was a country that had a modicum of safety was the United States. And that's why all the gold came over here. And we have it all now. Most of the major gold in Europe and England came here. Now, what it comes down to, the bottom line is this, that in these military courts, you're dealing with courts that, as I said before, sit in summary court-martial proceedings against civilians. Now, summary court-martials can be kind of bloody. unless you know what's going on. What's the very first piece of process that any court, including a military court, must issue before an action can be begun? I didn't say join, all right? Because there's several steps, at least in common law, before a plaintiff and a defendant, who isn't a defendant until joined. There are several steps in the common law that one must go through, assuming we have lawful courts, before there is a case that can be brought inside the bar. You know what the bar is? It's that little fence with the swinging gate and everything else that divides the gallery from the main part of the court. All right. Until a case cannot be brought in bar until the plaintiff and defendant are properly joined after going through the intermediate steps in lawful courts. The intermediate steps include, in this order, abatement, demur, joinder, rejoinder, rebutter, and surrebutter. All right. And the object of all that paperwork, flying back and forth between plaintiff and respondent or defendant, is to narrow the issues, get rid of all the extraneous stuff, and bring it down just to the bottom line, and that's the issue we go to court with. That's why common law cases were usually very simple and also very short, seldom lasting more than a week or so at the outside, usually over within a matter of 3 or 4 hours, because both the issues in the case were clearly defined, and thus, when guilt or innocence was determined, the outcome of the case could be clearly and quickly determined. Now, what did I say was the very first piece of process that one issues? Anytime you get paperwork from anybody who looks like they're trying to sue you or take your property, very first one you issue is an abatement, assuming there are errors in the plaintiff's paperwork. You see, the idea of the abatement, all right, is to give the plaintiff a better suit. You file it to correct errors in the plaintiff's process. And if the plaintiff cannot correct those errors, the plaintiff cannot bring a case. But you must file, serve, and if I ever say file an abatement, I want you guys to remind me what I said, okay? Because you never file an abatement in court. You never file a default in court. You always serve them on the parties. All right? Now, having said that, if I say filed anytime, I want to hear it from you, okay? Because I do slip every now and then. I've been spending so much time in bar, I've forgotten how to fight a case out of bar. All right? But the bottom line is, does a military court or a defendant who brings process in a military court have lawful process? What is the law of such courts during peacetime? Well, if you go through the sources, it's international and municipal law. All right? You look at international law, it's got some cute little things in it, you know. As long as there's full disclosure of everything that's going on, why you can't accuse anyone of fraud under international law. And that's why I don't join conspiracy movements. Because everything I need to know about what the government has done to us and why they've done it is a matter of public record. It must be that way, or you can bring fraud against anyone and make it stick in the United States government. But under international law, you have things like deceit is legal. You're a belligerent. You're an enemy. I'm the United States government. You're my enemy. I have the right to use deceit in order to deceive you and win any confrontation or engagement that we have between us. That's legal under international law. And any book you pick up, whether it's by Miss Dieter and her book on the laws of war, I can't remember her first name, it's like Phyllis DeLupus Dieter, all right, the laws of war, I remember the title of the book. Every single international law text you pick up, whether introductory or advanced, makes it very clear that deceit is legal. Thus, they don't have to tell you everything in court. They can deceive you in court, and it isn't fraud, because you're expected to know the law. All right? And everything's a matter of public record anyway. Now, we've been running around the patriot movement for the last, I don't know how many years, accusing every judge in any court you can find or in any court that you appear of fraud and misrepresentation and malfeasance and misfeasance and everything else. But those charges are only valid provided he breaks the international law, because that's the law under which he sits. And municipal law explains why virtually every small town in the country and county and state exists as a municipal corporation, and why there's so many municipal courts in all the states. Now, they're called by different names in different states, but they're all forms of municipal court. Especially a traffic court is a municipal court. Okay? It's important to remember these things, because if you're going into a court where it's international law or municipal law, you have to know the rules of process, don't you? You got to know the rules of the court. You got to also know the style manual. And the reason why you have to know these things is because therein lies the key to the effectiveness of a non-statutory abatement. Because under international law, no party to an action can appear in his own name. All right? You can only appear in a fictitious name. And what I'm going to do right now is let you all stand and stretch and say howdy to each other for about 10 minutes, and we'll reconvene at 8 o'clock, and I'll tell you the tricks used in deceit and deceiving the American people to take your process and dump it, and to take your property and use it. It's very interesting stuff.
Please stand by.
Good. Because starting Monday night, yours truly and Randy Lee will have the Tom Valentine Show. Okay? Starting Monday night, yours truly and Randy Lee will follow the Tom Valentine Show for an hour, 5 nights a week. Okay? So, stay tuned, all right? Now, yeah, I mean, it's really, you know, with Media Bypass magazine, okay? The guys at Media, yes, sir.
Right on show 8, right during Tom Valentine show.
When Tom Valentine show ends, there will be about a 15-second pause, and then you'll hear, "Hi, this is John Quade and Randy Lee. We're from the real government, and we're here to help you." All right. And, yes, yeah, they're setting up, low-power repeater stations for the satellite and everything else right now, all across the country. They got 4 or 5 on the West Coast already. They haven't quite got debugged. But I just wanted to pass that information along to you so you guys can all start joining in with us. Then you can stay current on what's happening with the processes we're developing, because the next process we're going to develop, and it's close. Right now, when I say close, it means that we haven't tested it in enough cases to make certain of its effectiveness. But the next process we're going to issue is writ of trespass. Whoa. And it smokes, I tell you. It smokes. Yes, sir.
Are you joining Bill Cook or displacing him? Cooper.
No, sir. I don't know. All I know is that I've come on immediately after Tom Valentine. I can't remember what show I'm doing now. That's all I know is, a couple of months ago, we weren't going to start until somewhere around the middle or the end of March, and then about 3 days ago, I was informed that we were going to start within the next week, and then night before last, they called and said, "Hi, John, we want you to start tonight." And I didn't have any equipment or anything in order to do the show, and so Randy and I went out to Radio Shack, man, and we kept the store open about an hour and 15 minutes after it was closed, after closing time, and bought all the equipment we needed, and mics and everything else, a mixer, and we're ready to go on the air, and we'll be on the air tonight, as a matter of fact, doing a test broadcast And but we start formally Monday night, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm enjoying it. Now, let's get into some real meat here, guys. We've already gone through Lincoln's whole thing and everything else, but in order to understand what's going on in the international and municipal law side of things, you have to understand that there's only two kinds of law available in America and most of the world. That is Roman law and Christian law, meaning also the common law, because common law is simply the collected traditions of Christians in ecclesiastical courts and other courts over the last 1,000 years. And the point is, with the active life of the law beginning in 1063, all right, that's anything before 1063 we don't claim. Anything after 1063 is part of our law, including Magna Carta, all right, which is key to some of the references in future process and various other things we're doing now. Anyway, the point is, to understand the international and military law that's being used right now, you have to understand something about the old Roman law and how Lincoln and his successors imported that Roman law into America for the very first time. In the old Roman law, whenever the Romans would, sweep into a country and conquer it, the subject peoples, for reasons which are purely technical, could not deal with the people as flesh and blood, the conquered people, as flesh and blood men and women. So they did what they called the process of novation. In novation, one is converted, as far as Roman law is concerned, from a flesh and blood man or woman, all right, and property, real, concrete, viable, physical property, is converted also to a fiction, because all military law is fictitious in nature. All right? There's a lot of people today that talk about the old Roman civil law. There was no such thing. That's simply a modern viewpoint being imposed back on Rome. In fact, Rome always used military law. Always. All right? At any rate, when you're a subject peoples, the old Roman law requires that the flesh and blood man and the real physical reality be converted to a fiction, which in Latin is called a persona. Ring a bell? Huh? Now, a persona, if you look it up in the Latin lexicons and dictionaries and the Latin encyclopedias, you'll find out persona literally means the mask of an actor. All right? It's a fictitious entity, a mask, that basically stands between you and the fictitious law created under a military government. Okay? The problem is, a fiction cannot see, hear, speak, write process, or develop an argument in court. So in the old Roman law, fictitious persona always had to appear by advocates, which we would call an attorney. Okay? The attorney was a Roman citizen, and he could enter pleas on behalf of fictitious persona. Now, how does that relate to today's courts? In today's courts, all parties to an action, because under international and municipal law, must appear as something other than themselves in flesh and blood. In other words, they must appear as a fiction. Sounds like old Roman law all over again, doesn't it? And that's why you're called a person. You see? It's the modern English equivalent to a persona. The question is, how do we identify the persona? Well, that's done with a name of war, a war name, called the nom de guerre. It's a French term. Okay? Nom de guerre, just like nom de plume. Okay, it means pen name. Nom de guerre means war name. That war name is signified by a name in all caps, as is on all of your driver's licenses right now, or in a name in which one of your Christian names has been abbreviated to an initial, like David K. as opposed to David Kenneth, which might be the Christian name. All right? That fictional entity called the persona or the person, and I think we've probably all heard the citation in that Church of Scientology, the U.S. Department of Justice, in which the court said that the word person encompasses a variety of entities, not human beings. Okay? That ought to told us something right there, but the significance of that statement just kind of went over everybody's head. See? And if you read all the titles and codes, they only apply to persons, don't they? All right? Read all your state codes, your county codes and statutes and ordinances and everything else, they only apply to persons, don't they? For some reason, which I've been unable to fathom, a military court cannot bring an action successfully in any civil matter or administrative matter against anything but fiction. In other words, they will never bring an action against you in your fully, properly spelled, according to the rules of English, Christian name. And the phrase Christian name is the name that's used in all the sources. They all talk about the Christian name, which is a name fully spelled in upper and lower case, including your first, middle, and last. My youngest boy is really going to give him a fit because he's got 4 names. Joseph Paul Free Saunders, which is my Christian name. My Christian name is John William Saunders. But when I used to have a driver's license years ago, it was always John W. Saunders, and it was all capitalized, so I was a double nom de guerre. I guess that's some kind of a rare distinction, or it just means that the computer doesn't have that many characters on that line that it can print. Point is that once the fiction is created, you also find that the court styles itself as a fiction because it's also in capital letters. And every time the IRS sends you any process, or the municipal court, or traffic courts, or any of these other military courts, they either send the process to you and the name is all caps and their name is also in all capital letters, or one or the other name is abbreviated. That's without question the way it appears every single time. Because they're bound by the rules of international and municipal law. And under the rules of international law, no party to a case can appear in his own name. Period. Now, the problem becomes, I know some guys out there thinking, well, now that's great as far as that's concerned, but are you telling us that they use novation on us nowadays to create the person, the fictitious entity? Yes, I am. The word novation appears nowhere in American law prior to the War between the States. Came in after the war. 1867, I think, is the earliest case. Is that correct, Randy? 1867? Yeah. So, you say, yeah, but there's still some loose links here, you know, because in American law, we got the common law, which the Romans didn't have, and there's certain protections there in the common law that makes it very difficult for anyone to claim that they can create a fictitious persona and through that fictitious persona seize the property of the flesh and blood man. How do they manage that? Romans didn't have a problem with it because there wasn't any common law in the countries that they captured and seized. All right? In the common law, it's important that you are addressed by your proper Christian name. Now you may understand, for some of you who are thinking ahead of me now, why it was in 1933 the United States Supreme Court was given the power to merge the rules of procedure and get rid of the common law process. All right? That was one of the reasons. That covered Roosevelt's backside. All right? When he extended the Trading with the Enemy Act to all of us and declared us belligerent enemies, alien enemies. The point being that there has to be some way, by virtue of the block of the common law, which we still have access to as people, but not with an attorney, okay, because the attorney can only use the law of the court that licensed him to practice. All right? We still have access as individual people, human beings, Christians. I don't like using the word human beings, and I just did. Randy's going to tell you what the word really means when it comes his turn here in just a few minutes. The point is there's got to be some way to circumvent the effect of the common law. And that's done with a new twist that was kind of added by the American legal profession. It's called suretyship. And thus when you're born, they put your footprint on a piece of paper immediately before your foot ever touches the land as a baby. Okay? And a birth certificate is issued, which is then placed on file with the Commerce Department and the U.S. Bureau of Census, and for doing this little deed, the hospital gets paid $4,000 by the United States government. Now you know why, when a woman is most vulnerable after having just given birth to a child, the nurses or the medical technicians or someone else will come in and start pressing you for a name that can be put on a birth certificate. And why, at the same time, they want you to fill out a form for a Social Security number for a child. Because that saves the government a lot of problems later on. Why is that? Because the novation process is not complete, and neither is suretyship until the man who is in the process of novation, by his own hand, applies for a benefit, privilege, or opportunity. Then suretyship is closed. And now the flesh and blood man has sworn on his application, sure it's not in the application, but it's implied, all right, is now the surety for this fictitious persona. And the common law, allegedly, isn't going to do you any good, right? That was the theory. And like McClintock said in his book on equity in 1967, he said the point of merging the rules was to get rid of the common law procedure, but to date this has not happened. So that was in 1967, because even in McClintock's day, 30 years ago, there were still people utilizing and filing common law action. All right? Now, what happens then is that the individual now goes in and answers for this persona, and because of his suretyship, the flesh and blood man's property guarantees the persona. All right? Now, if you want to understand how this process works, it's a very simple thing you can look up in Black's Law Dictionary. It's called discussion. And pay particular attention to the benefit of discussion, because there is no argument in the current courts. All there is discussion. And when you communicate with the court in any way other than by saying, I object to being falsely mustered or falsely arrested or whatever, I object, I object, I object. Because if you communicate with a court, give it information, answer a question or ask a question, you can cede jurisdiction. And only when you object, from the moment the police officer puts his hands on you, start objecting. All right? And if he arrests you and takes you to jail, continue to object. Sign nothing, offer no information whatsoever of any kind. Now, the reason why you do that, of course, is because then habeas corpus will lie. Okay? Did you hear what I just said? Habeas corpus will lie, and there's dozens and dozens of court cases on this. All right? As well as procedures in military law, which make it very clear if you can read a little bit between the lines, that habeas corpus will only lie when the defendant objects continually. Accept nothing from them. Okay? And then if you've got a Jural Society going where you're a member and the word gets out, the Jural Society should have competency enough to file a writ of habeas corpus immediately in the Texas Supreme Court. Okay? Because we've used that little trick twice in California, both times it worked. All right? Now, by the way, we don't have a writ of habeas corpus package. Okay? We're not ready for that yet. The point is that once you've committed some act whereby you're brought before the court involuntarily, your only out is an objection. All right? Or to do what Randy did. My name is not da-da-da-da-da-da. My flag is the original flag of the Republic of Texas, and my law is the King James Bible. Further, I say it's not. sit down and don't say nothing. Because the judge is going to try to trick you into making some admission or confession, and that's all you have to do, an admission or confession, because you're in there standing as surety for this fictitious persona, and all you have to do is make an admission or confession in the court or in the presence of the judge or any one other official of the jail, and suretyship is closed and it's a matter of record now. Okay? And you're dead meat. Now, tomorrow, when we start getting into the details of the non-statutory abatement, see, the object of tonight is to give you all the background, so tomorrow we don't have to deal with that stuff, and we can go through and take you step by step through everything in the Book of the Hundreds, including the non-statutory abatements as well as the American Jural Society Handbook. All right? Because now, when we say nom de guerre, you'll know what we're talking about. Now, when we say make no admission and confession, etc., you'll know exactly what we're talking about, and I don't have to cover that tomorrow. The point is that if you continually object, you open the way for subsequent process in common law, because the flesh and blood man, if he's a Christian, can use the common law to his advantage. All right? Now, what happens with the abatement when you file it? Come on, guys. How long I got to wait, guys? It's served. You serve the abatement, you never file it because, and I better explain that. You only file process in bar after the parties are joined. A non-statutory abatement is an out-of-bar plea. There's no case yet. So process there is served on all parties, either by a sheriff's deputy, by registered mail, or if you got a Jural Society form, by a leaseors in the Jural Society. Okay? At any rate, what happens now when you file this non-statutory abatement and you got this persona here with oh, you guys are starting to wake up a little faster. Come on, get a little courage here, guys. Just tell me, all right? When you serve the non-statutory abatement process, you have the persona here, the flesh and blood man back here, all right? This is what the court sees, and the suretyship that's presumed is like this, and what happens when you file the non-statutory abatement is, when you serve the non-statutory abatement, it drives a wedge between the persona and the flesh and blood man, and says, now you got to prove it, according to the rule of law, not international or municipal law, that I knowingly, willingly, voluntarily entered into a suretyship for a fictitious entity. That's what the non-statutory abatement does. It drives a wedge between the fictitious persona out here and the real flesh and blood man, and separates the two at law, not under international or municipal law, at law, in common law, lex non scripta. All right? Now the court's got a problem because it can deal all it wants to with this persona out here, but it's a fiction, an illusion. They can't collect any property from a fiction and an illusion. The only way they can collect any money or property is if the fiction is tied through suretyship to the flesh and blood man, but the abatement has just severed that. Now I'm standing here on the law of God and the lex non scripta. The fiction is somewhere out there in space that doesn't even concern me. And that explains why when you, for example, abate a traffic citation and then file the default, serve the default. Nobody's said anything. I'm quicker than you are. When you serve the default, all right, that the warrant is pulled back from the field. The cop running out here on the highway doesn't know that there's a bench warrant issued for you anymore, because the bench warrant has been withdrawn to the dominions or the domain of the court. Thus, 6 months later, and I think it's about a year before this is terminated, but it varies from state to state. Anytime you go into the court building itself, if they identify you as a flesh and blood man who may be connected with this surety, as surety for this fiction that they have this bench warrant issued for, they'll arrest you right there on the spot. We had one poor guy in California. It's kind of funny. It's kind of sad too. But he served a non-statutory abatement on a traffic ticket that he had. And about 5 months later, without thinking about it, he went into that same court in a subsequent divorce action with his wife. As soon as he stood up and stated his name, man, they walked over and, "Excuse me, sir, you're going to jail. We have a warrant for your arrest." And he protested and everything else, and then they showed him this bench warrant that had been issued for him. So he didn't realize, and then after he got out of jail, he called him. He said, "What happened? I thought the abatement worked." Yes, it did work. It stopped all the process beyond the bounds of the military authorities' facility. All right? Out here in the hinterlands, there is no record of the warrant having been issued. But in their dominions, it always lays there to keep the persona from visiting the court again. All right? More importantly, it keeps the Christian man from visiting the court again because we don't belong in their court. All right? Those courts are created, and Randy will bring this out when he gets into the definitions and everything else, which is in the next hour. We don't belong in their courts because all the definitions apply to not to Christians, but to non-Christians. All the codes, ordinances, rules, statutes, etc. People without a moral law, which means non-Christians, is what all these codes in the military jurisdiction is written for. That's why when I go serving a process of some kind, the first thing I do is write my name in upper and lower case. I even separate my first two names from my last name because only the first two names are my Christian name. My last name is a family name, and my first two names are my name. My last name is shared in common by many others, so it's not my exclusive property. So I separate it. Usually put a colon between the first two names and the last name. See? We used to recommend a comma, but we've since, with some further study, determined that a colon is even better. The point being is that we don't belong in those courts, and if we understand the process that God has given us in the common law, the lex non scripta, and learn how to use it again, then we roll back the ability of their courts to serve any kind of fictitious process against us in the wrong name. And when they can't serve process against us, at least process that's effective, then what happens to the revenue? It starts to drop significantly. I don't know how many times our abatement packages have been copied and redistributed across this country. Some people have estimated as high as 25,000 copies. And that may very well be. I know Randy and I didn't see any of the money. But the point is that for a $25 abatement package, we've cost the United States government and the state governments and the counties and the cities across this country a pretty good-sized piece of change in the last year. And we intend to increase the numbers because now, if the IRS ignores a lien or levy, and we serve the abatement and the default, what is our remedy when they ignore the paperwork? Because the non-statutory abatement constitutes, with the default, res judicata, final judgment has been made, all the charges that you cited in your abatement are proven in law. That's all the evidence you need to go to small claims court personally against the IRS agent. Now, he's got to explain, first of all, why a criminal has not complied with the law. And then he's got to also prove that a real lien exists. The IRS doesn't have standing to create a real lien or levy, and only with your voluntary consent in ignorance do they ever seize anyone's property. It was Judge Bork, remember the judge they didn't want on the Supreme Court? The Judge Bork in his book that said 85 to 95% of all the people in jails volunteered for it because they didn't know any better, and neither did their lawyers, who are agents of the court. I always love that. How many of you have you ever seen a copy of Corpus Juris Secundum in there and looked up attorneys at law? And it says in there that the attorney's first responsibility is to function as an agent of the court, and his second responsibility is to enforce public morals. I've no idea what that means, but I know it has nothing to do with Christianity and the common law. It can't be. And then his third responsibility is to his mistress. And his fourth, the client comes in there third. I'm sorry. Now, in fact, I guess in real, that's just a book anyway. In real circumstances, his mistress is probably third. His wife is somewhere down around sixth or seventh, and his Mercedes-Benz is probably fourth. And the client is somewhere off in the distance there, who's only there for the fleecing. The point being, guys, is that when the persona has been separated by a real lawful process from the flesh and blood, man or woman, the court now has an insurmountable problem. And so long as you don't re-enter the venue again, their venue, then that process will never be served on you again. Now, that's only because of one thing. Because we recognized the persona when we saw it. And because we knew the difference between fiction and real law. Because they have nothing but fiction. And without your voluntary consent, there is no jurisdiction established, as Judge Bork pointed out in his book. Remember that. When you're dealing, or any time these people send you anything in the mail, what's the purpose of an IRS letter? Well, yeah, to get your consent, because you might just roll over, and cough up the money without any further proceedings that could be costly, And, yeah, but it also does one other thing. No. Yeah, but it also does one other thing, guys. Tells the IRS that if you respond with a letter, you don't know anything about law. Because letters have no force and effect in law. What they expect you to do, of course, is you get that letter, and your hands are going like this, and you can't even read it, and you say, Martha June, hold my head still, I can't read, and you get all nervous and everything else, and you start seeing your bank account go flying off down the river, and the next thing you knew, man, you're sitting there trying to write a letter, with a hand that's really, Martha June, you're going to have to write the letter for me, because I can't, get Junior on a computer over there and have him write the letter. He'll write what I tell him to, and then you can't remember what your name is, That's the kind of response they want. Because you always make mistakes when you do that. You see? But the only response that we ever do anymore is immediately serve lawful process in response to an unlawful letter. Serve notice right from the get-go. They get the picture real quick. Now, I'll tell you what happened in California several times. When they wouldn't pay any attention to the abatements, we simply had one friend of ours who took our abatement package and he served it and then served the default and everything else. And he went down to check a few days later and found out that the levy on his account was still in place. And so he said, I wonder. He took the abatement and the default, went down to small claims court and filed an action, and they served the process for you, by the way. All right, on the IRS agent. And within about 3 days, 72 hours after the IRS agent got the service of process from small claim court, lo and behold, the levy was gone. Just disappeared. The release came through the mail and all that whole 9 yards, you see. Because he figured that he could ignore it as long as you didn't have any further options. But not only do you have further options, but we have a package right now we're testing with 2 cases in California, in which we bypass the small claims court and go straight to the superior court, which in Texas would be the district court, and there's no limit now on small claims damages. Now you can get real restitution. All we got to do, guys, is to get a dozen of those across the country to stick. And believe me, the morale problem that Al Adask and I were talking about earlier today in the IRS is going to suddenly go even lower and get even worse. Because these guys right now are having a lot of problems with some of this process that's being filed. And it's only because people really don't have any training in law that they haven't thought of themselves of filing subsequent process now using the abatement and default as proof. That they ignored the law, and also that these 13 charges against the IRS here are true. Now, one of the pieces of process that we brought along here just recently, and it's in the new package here, is the non-statutory abatement of persona designata. More Latin. Whoa. You know, a persona designata is simply the person designated. Okay, that's all it is. And we file that. Now, we recommend that everyone file one of those, whether you've got an action against you by some court or not, because you make it a matter of public record long before any action is ever brought against you, and then you post the default in 3 places in the county. Or publish it in the newspaper if you want to. You've got the money. All right? The advantage is, the abatement of the persona designata. I think it's the very first abatement in the sample form in the back of the non-statutory abatement package. The very first one. All right. Yes, ma'am. Yes, we're going to cover it in detail. Now, the point is, guys, that you got this big bad military power out there that has all the guns and all the power and everything else, and I'll have to be quite honest with you. There has to be some kind of an unwritten rule or law someplace that we have yet to find why it is they obey the law. Al?
I'll make you exactly, because you asked the question before. You asked the question before about, you don't understand why, something about the connection they won't, if you can make that separation between the fiction and the person, they don't go, the real flesh and blood person, they don't go after the flesh and blood?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll bet you money it's a war crime. I'll bet you money that what you're doing with the rest of the novation, the social security number, you are an agent of the belligerent state. But if you don't have that tie to the belligerent state that they're fighting against, you're a civilian. It's I'll bet you the clue, if you're looking for this, I'd look into the Nuremberg war trials, and I'd look into the Geneva Convention, and what happens to a man if he makes war, a military person goes ahead and shoots a civilian who's not a belligerent in a war. Does that make any sense?
That makes more sense to me than I care to deal with, Randy. Huh?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it all.
Well, what he was saying basically is the reason why they don't come after the flesh and blood man once you serve the abatement and it goes to default is because under the Nuremberg trials and it's probably a war crime to come after a civilian when the flesh and blood man.
A non-belligerent. I'll bet you that's where it is. You can file these. I'll bet there's a way of getting these guys for war crimes if they come after you in your flesh and blood capacity. We're looking into development so that we can go to the World Congress.
But that's the. Thanks, Al. Really, I'm serious, guy. You put it together for me anyway.
When you made the comment, it just rang my bell as soon as
Because I've been thinking about that and trying to find, because I told Al earlier today when we discussed it that there had to be some documentary connection on paper somewhere.
They hung those guys in Nuremberg, and that's the documentary connection. The rope around their neck. You make war on civilians, you get hung.
Not only that, in the process of the Republic of Texas, when the documents were sent to Hague, Netherlands, they replied back to the provisional government of Texas, we are a de facto corporate court and cannot hear an issue from a sovereign.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it makes perfect sense.
Yes, it does. Now I got a place I can go look because I'll have that information nailed down within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. Because if that's the case, then we've got a major new weapon, and like I said before, guys, I never know where this information has come from. Al and I sit in there in this little place eating popcorn and getting the salty fingers and everything else for about 2.5, 3 hours a day, and I was beating my head against the wall trying to figure out why it is that they have this. Where's the documentary connection? I know what they do. They respond to it as if it's, the cross before Dracula. They respond to it, but where's the documentary evidence why they should do that? That always bothered me. I think now that we've got a major new weapon developing. Thank you, Al. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. God bless you, sir. Now, people, what we need to think of here, and I'm going to come down on a closing here pretty soon so that Randy can get into the definitions, and I think these are going to kind of blow your mind away when he gets to the definition. What we need to realize is that one of the reasons why, which supports what you just got through saying now, one of the reasons why they don't come directly after us is also because of the fact that in the military law and the international law, they're required to respect the customs and usages of the occupied country. That's also an important argument. Not near as good as the one you just raised, I think, but that is an argument that's in the sources. Okay, and I might add that we went through 259 titles in the UCLA and Los Angeles law libraries on military government and martial rule. We narrowed it down to 42 titles and finally settled on one essay and one book, which you can get from Randy. It's called Military Government and Martial Rule by Berkheimer. All right? And in the list of products in the back of the Book of the Hundreds, it's in there. That's a book that'll really open your head as far as what's going on with the courts. And the other book you need is the 1984/94 edition of the Manual of Courts Martial. Between those two books, you'll be able to figure out every single thing the courts do. All right? Why they do process the way they do it. Why they file it the way they file it against you. Why bench warrants are issued in spite of the fact that in almost every state I know of, all warrants must issue through the district or county attorney's office. And yet judges issue bench warrants all the time. Now you know why it is when you go out, for example, and you get stopped by a cop and you make the blunder of stepping out of your car. Why they tow your car? Because under military law, you've abandoned the property. Okay? And once you all abandon property, becomes automatically the property of the conquering power under military law. Okay? I never and until we found that, I couldn't understand why I got on my 4th or 5th arrest. I can't remember which one. The guy, the sheriff's deputy said, "Get out of the car." And I said, "No. I'm staying right here. I got no reason to get out of this car." And he says, "Okay." All he did was write me a citation. On the other 3 prior occasions when I got out of the car, he towed it every single time. I never understood that until Randy found an obscure reference in the Manual for Courts Martial, which classifies such property as abandoned property. Now, having covered all this background, all you need is a clear understanding of about 24 words. Person, human being, natural person, natural man, etc. And some other concepts and ideas, which Randy's he's gonna, in this Mellencamp Dictionary of Law and the Oxford English Dictionary and the other dictionary sites that are in that one little package that you've got that came with the Book of the Hundreds, the stack of paper about yay thick. All right, all the original source documents for this is in that package, including my favorite definition of a bureaucrat. One who works with a fixed routine without exercising intelligent judgment. I love that. Now, what? That's actually in the Random's house, and people didn't believe me, so Randy decided to copy that out of the dictionary and tack it on the back of the package, so I'd have some credibility here. The point is, guys, is that you now understand why it is military law and its understanding is important for your being able to understand the court process that exists today. All right? You also understand now why the common law, when properly served in such courts, wins when properly written and served, wins 100% of the time. Because it comes in here from this level, the highest level of law there is next to the scriptures, and the law they're using, I call it mud law because it's down here in the mud when on the scale of the hierarchy of law. And the reason why it wins is because we can come in and hit them, but they don't have standing to come up and hit us. And I think that, this is really getting to my head now, what you just got through saying. It's interrupting my whole train of thought because the possibilities in that are pregnant really doesn't describe the possibilities that are in that, okay? The point is that once you understand the military background, once you understand that our law comes in from the highest possible law, higher even than the Constitution, because the Constitution is, after all, a mere statute. Now, some of you guys that are real constitutional devotees, you got to reckon with the fact that the Constitution is, after all, just a statute. All right? 1 U.S. 1. All right? It is a statute. And the common law, embodied in the Constitution, was used to frame the document, which is merely a statute. And that's why when somebody asked me out in the hall a while ago, well, can we use codification to the common law? I said no, because as soon as it's codified and passed by a legislature, it becomes a statute, and it's no longer valid. Now, one last thing, and then we're going to take a little short break here, and then Randy's going to finish off the evening, and I got to rush upstairs and set up the mixers and everything else to get ready to do our show tonight after Tom Valentine. There's one class of people in the law reform movement that we looked long and hard to find a name for, and we finally ended up with kitchen sinkers. Because these guys, when they file process, throw in everything they can think of, including the kitchen sink, and then wonder why it is they lose. And generally their reaction is, well, they're just rolling over us. No, you've taken a knife to a gunfight and thought that with a multiplicity of knives that you would somehow overcome the automatic weapons of the enemy. That's not only stupid, it's probably a gross embarrassment if you really understood what's going on. I know they're not coming after me because they don't know I'm in Texas. Now, the point I'm making, guys, is this. Don't use any statutes in any common law process, all right? Don't sign UCC 1-207 without prejudice underneath your signature on a common law process. You destroy the process because you've brought a statute into a non-statutory instrument. We understand ourselves? Huh?